everything you can. Hello, Google Fire phone plan that.
Walking through the park in May, he saw a small brown snake slipping away from him through grass and leaves, and he went after it with a long twig, feeling as he did so the instinctive fear of man for reptiles. Ah, he thought, are a symbol of evil, and he touched the snake with the twig, making it squirm. The snake lifted its head and struck at the twig, then shot away through the grass, hurrying fearfully, and he went after it. It was very beautiful, and it was amazingly clever, but he intended to stay with it for a while and find out something about it. The little brown snake led him deep into the park, so that he was hidden from view and alone with it. He had a guilty feeling that in pursuing the snake he was violating some rule of the park, and he prepared a remark for anyone who might discover him. "I am a student of contemporary morality," he thought he would say, or "I'm a sculptor, and I am studying the structure of reptiles." At any rate, he wouldn't make some sort of reasonable explanation. He would not say that he intended to kill the snake. He moved beside the frightened reptile, leaping now and then to keep up with it, until the snake became exhausted and could not go on. Then he squatted on his heels to have a closer view of it, holding the snake before him by touching it with a twig. He admitted to himself that he was afraid to touch it with his hands. To touch a snake was to touch something secret in the mind of man, something one ought never to bring out into the light. That sleek gliding and that awful silence was once man, and now that man had come to this last form, here were snakes still moving over the earth as if no change had ever taken place. The first male and female, biblical, and evolution, Adam and Eve, and the human embryo. It was a lovely snake, clean and graceful and precise. The snake's fear frightened him, and he became panic-stricken, thinking that perhaps all the snakes in the park would come quietly to the rescue of the little brown snake and surround him with their malicious silence and the unbearable horror of their evil forms. It was a large park, and there must be thousands of snakes in it. If all the snakes were to find out that he was with this little snake, they would easily be able to paralyze him. He stood up and looked around. All was quiet. The silence was almost the biblical silence of "in the beginning." He could hear a bird hopping from twig to twig in a low earth bush nearby, but he was alone with the snake. He forgot that he was in a public park, in a large city. An airplane passed over, but he did not see or hear it. The silence was too emphatic, and his vision was too emphatically focused on the snake before him. In the garden with the snake, unnaked, in the beginning, in the year 1931. He squatted on his heels again and began to commune with the snake. It made him laugh, inwardly and outwardly, to have the form of the snake so substantially before him, apart from his own being, flat on the surface of the earth, instead of subtly a part of his own identity. It was really a tremendous thing. At first he was afraid to speak aloud, but as time went on he became less timid, and he began to speak in English to it. It was very pleasant to speak to the snake. "All right," he said, "here I am, after all these years, a young man living on the same earth, under the same sun, having the same passions. And here you are before me, the same. The situation is the same. What do you intend to do? Escape? I will not let you escape. What have you in mind? How will you defend yourself? I intend to destroy you, as an obligation to man." The snake twitched before him helplessly, unable to avoid the twig. It struck at the twig several times and then became too tired to bother with it. He drew away the twig and heard the snake say, "Thank you." He began to whistle to the snake, so if the music would have any effect on its movement, if it would make the snake dance. "You are my love," he whistled, Schubert made into a New York musical comedy. "My only love, my only love." But the snake would not dance. Something Italian, perhaps, he thought, and he began to sing La Donna è mobile, intentionally mispronouncing the words in order to amuse himself. He tried a Brahms lullaby, but the music had no effect on the snake. He was tired, he was frightened, and wanted to get away. He was amazed at himself suddenly. It occurred to him to let the snake flee, to let it glide away and be lost in the lowly words of its kind. Why should he allow it to escape? He lifted a heavy boulder from the ground and thought, "Now I shall bash your head with this rock and see you die." To destroy that evil grace, to mangle that sinful loveliness. But it was very strange. He could not let the rock fall on the snake's head, and he began suddenly to feel very sorry for it. "I am sorry," he said, dropping the boulder. "I beg your pardon. I see now that I have only love for you." And he wanted to touch the snake with his hands, to hold it and understand the truth of its touch. But it was difficult. The snake was frightened, and each time he extended his hand to touch it, the snake turned on him and charged. "I have only love for you," he said. "Do not be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you." Then, swiftly, he lifted the snake from the earth, learned the true feel of it, and dropped it. "There," he said. "Now I know the truth. The snake is cold, but it is clean. It is not slimy as I thought." He smiled upon the little brown snake. "You may go now," he said. "The Inquisition is over. You are yet alive. You have been in the presence of man, and you are yet alive. You may go now." But the snake would not go away. It was exhausted with fear. He felt deeply ashamed of what he had done, and angry with himself. "Jesus," he thought, "I've scared the little snake. It will never get over this. It will always remember me squatting over it." "For God's sake," he said to the snake, "go away. Return to your kind. Tell them what you saw, you, yourself, with your own eyes. Tell them what you felt. The sicky heat of the hand of man. Tell them of the presence you felt." Suddenly the snake turned from him and spilled itself forward, away from him. "Thank you," he said. And it made him laugh with joy to see the little snake throwing itself into the grass and leaves, thrusting itself away from man. "Splendid," he said. "Hurry to them and say that you were in the presence of man, that you were not killed. Think of all the snakes that live and die without ever meeting man. Think of the distinction it will mean for you." It seemed to him that the little snake's movements away from him were the essence of joyous laughter, and he felt greatly pleased. He found his way back to the path and continued his walk. In the evening, while she sat at the piano playing softly, he said, "A funny thing happened." She went on playing. "A funny thing?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I was walking through the park, and I saw a little brown snake." She stopped playing and turned on the bench to look at him. "A snake?" she said. "How ugly!" "No," he said. "It was beautiful." "What about it?" "Oh, nothing," he said. "I just caught it and wouldn't let it go for a while." "But why?" "For no good reason at all," he said. She walked across the room and sat beside him, looking at him strangely. "Tell me about the snake," she said. "It was lovely," he said, "not ugly at all. When I touched it, I felt its cleanliness." "I'm so glad," she said. "What else?" "I wanted to kill the snake," he said, "but I couldn't. It was too lovely." "I'm so glad," she said. "But tell me everything." "That's all," he said. "But it isn't," she said. "I know it isn't. Tell me everything." "It is very funny," he said. "I was going to kill the snake and not come here again." "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" she said. "Of course I am," he said. "What else?" she said. "What do you think of me when you had the snake before you?" "You will be angry," he said. "Oh, nonsense. It is impossible for me to be angry with you. Tell me." "Well," he said, "I thought you were lovely, but evil." "Evil? I told you you'd be angry." "And then?" "Then I touched the snake," he said. "It wasn't easy, but I picked it up with my hands. What do you make of this? You've read a lot of books about such things. What does it mean, my picking up the snake?" She began to laugh softly, intelligently. "Why, She laughed. It simply means that you're an idiot. Why, it's splendid. Is that according to Freud? He said. Yes, she laughed. According to Freud. Well, anyway, he said, it was very fine to let the snake go free. Have you ever told me you loved me? She asked. You ought to know, he said. I do not remember one or two things I've said to you. No, she said. You've never told me. She began to laugh again, feeling suddenly very happy about him. You've always talked of other things, she said. Irrelevant things, at the most amazing times. She laughed. The snake, he said, was a little brown snake. And that explains it, she said. You have never intruded. What the hell are you talking about? He said. I'm so glad you didn't kill the snake, she said. She turned to the piano, placed her hand softly upon the keys. I whistled a few songs to the snake, he said. I whistled a fragment from Schubert's Unfinished Symphony. I'd like to hear that. You know, the melody that we used in the musical comedy called Blossom Time. The part that goes, you are my only love, and so on. She began to play softly, feeling his eyes on her hair, on her hands, her neck, her back, her arms, feeling him studying her as he had studied the snake.
Seemed the better way when first I heard him.
Saroyan.